tell you about my post-war life, because I also talk about intergenerational trauma. I was born Erika Hornstein on April 23, 1944, in the Nyíregyháza, Hungary ghetto. 2 weeks later, all of the women and children in my family were transported to Auschwitz to be murdered. That defines me as a Holocaust survivor, and that was how I lived my life for 44 years. Much of those years were ruled by my role as the child of a survivor. My mother was totally destroyed by the war. She lost her entire family. She was born in the town of Hajdúshamshon. Until her mid-teens, my mother lived surrounded by grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Her entire family lived within walking distance of each other. Her parents were Honey Wertheimer and David Petrover. She had 2 sisters, Margit and Olga. She also had 2 brothers, Avram and Yena. In 1938, when my mother was just 16 years old, the Hungarian government passed laws restricting Jewish participation in ordinary day-to-day life. Jews were forbidden to participate in most professions. Jewish children weren't allowed to attend public schools. Jews were forced to abandon their homes. My mother's family was forced from their home in Hajdúshamshon and moved to the city of Nyíregyháza. Sometime in early 1943, my grandfather's sister, Rose, began to bombard my grandfather with letters, begging him to get the family out of Europe. She lived in New York and had already begun the process of getting everyone to safety. His response was no. He believed the family was safe and that the war would be over long before the Nazis turned their attention to Hungary. My parents had been living in Budapest, and by that time my father had already been drafted into a forced labor camp. My mother was alone and frightened. At first, wives were permitted to visit their husbands, and in the fall of 1943, my mother learned that she was pregnant. She was no longer permitted to visit my father, so she left their Budapest apartment and moved in with her parents in Nyíregyháza. On March 19, 1944, Nazis occupied the town. By April 17th, they completed the construction of the ghetto. A wall topped with barbed wire encircled the entire Jewish neighborhood. Jews from all the surrounding towns were herded into the ghetto. On April 24th, the ghetto was sealed. I was 1 day old. My grandparents' home was within the boundaries of the ghetto, so all of my mother's female relatives and their children were moved into the house. There were only 123 houses for over 17,000 Jews, so I can well imagine how many others were in that house. Within a couple of days, my grandfather was dragged from the home and never seen again. Family members in the house included my grandmother, great-grandmother, and 2 aunts. There were also 4 children, me and 3 little cousins, 9-year-old Mickey, 7-year-old Imre, and 2.5-year-old Shishi. When word reached my father that my mother had given birth, he somehow managed to escape from the labor camp and headed straight to Nyíregyháza. The Nazis required that all Jews be imprisoned in a ghetto closest to their official address. My father had papers with the address of their Budapest apartment. The Jews in Budapest had not yet been rounded up, and he knew that he could buy time if he could get us there. I was just a few days old when he arrived. He immediately went to the office of the authorities, which in Hungary was the Arrow Cross, a segment of the Hungarian military that was more than happy to help the Nazis. My father presented the papers showing that my mother and I should officially be in Budapest. The details of how he managed to get permission to take us to Budapest were never clear to me. All I know from what my mother told me is that he received the required permission when I was just over a week old. Knowing that as an escapee he was being hunted and afraid to be with us in case he was discovered with us, my father returned to the labor camp immediately after getting us to Budapest. He was murdered on March 8, 1945, just 2 months before the Allies liberated the camps. My mother's 19-year-old sister, Olga, somehow was able to slip out of the ghetto when my father got my mother and me out, and she also headed straight to Budapest. When they reached the city, my mother and Olga were able to obtain Christian identity papers, get an apartment, and lived quietly for 2 months as 2 Christian women. In early May, everyone who remained in my grandparents' home were transported by cattle car to Auschwitz. When the cattle cars were unloaded at Auschwitz, a life-or-death decision was made immediately by the presiding SS officer. A person's answer to the simple questions, how old, healthy or ill, determined whether you would live or die. The elderly, too young to work, or ill were sent immediately to the gas chamber. If you were clutching a child who was too young to work, you were sent to the gas chamber with the child. No one grabbed a child away from its mother. That would cause panic, and panic was to be avoided at all costs. My mother's older sister, Margie, and sister-in-law, Clara, were the only ones who survived the initial selections. Jewish prisoners who were forced to help unload the cattle cars tried to save the lives of the young mothers by urging them to hand their children over to elderly people. They knew that if these mothers reached the front of the line with their children, they would be sent with the children to the gas chamber. At the urging of the Jewish prisoners, Margie and Clara handed the 3 children to my grandmother. On that very day, my great-grandmother, grandmother, and 3 little cousins were murdered in the gas chamber. I can't imagine what my grandmother's last moments must have been like in the gas chamber with her 3 grandchildren. In Budapest, my mother and her teenage sister Olga were living in relative safety. My mother stayed in the apartment with me while Olga went out for food. On July 5th, 1944, Olga left the apartment. Just as she stepped out of the building, a former neighbor recognized her and yelled, "She's a Jew." Nearby Arrow Cross soldiers immediately ran in her direction. She turned and ran back into the building with the soldiers close behind. She must have realized that she had very few options, or none at all, that wouldn't lead the soldiers directly to my mother and me, hiding in the apartment. So she made a fateful decision. My teenage aunt raced to the roof of the building and jumped. She died on Budapest sidewalk on July 5th, 1944. My mother and I were never discovered. My mother immediately left the apartment, went into hiding, and was never willing to tell me anything more about how we survived. It wasn't until after the war that my mother learned how her older sister Margie died. Clara, her sister-in-law, survived and was with Margie on the day that she was murdered. Margie survived until the very end, working in the kitchens of Auschwitz. On the day of liberation, on the very day that the Allies entered Auschwitz to liberate the prisoners, many of the remaining Nazis were so intent on killing Jews that instead of fleeing from the Allies, they stayed to randomly shoot and kill as many Jews as they could. My Aunt Margie was killed on the day of liberation. So that's the story of the murder of my father and of my mother's entire family. However, that's not the end of my story. As a result of the brutal murder of her entire family, and all that she had witnessed. My mother suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. But PTSD wasn't recognized until after the Vietnam War, and by that time, it was far too late to protect me. The damage that her emotional collapse inflicted was profound. My childhood was hell. She was my only parent, my only adult family member. I know she loved me because of all she did for me, but she destroyed my childhood because of all that she did to me. By the time I began to understand the implications of her experiences and how they affected me, I had already spent years repeating her self-destructive behavior. And as a result, I inflicted a lot of emotional damage on my kids. Sometime after the war ended, my mother's Aunt Rose discovered that we had survived. We were living in Budapest. In the chaos of post-war Europe, no one knew who was dead or alive. My mother believed that anyone looking for her would be looking in Budapest. Aunt Rose began the process of getting us to the United States and urged my mother to leave Hungary as soon as possible. She refused. It took her over 2 years to accept the fact that she and I were the only survivors, and she finally agreed to leave Hungary. But by this time, everything had changed. Hungary was now a communist country, and it was almost impossible to get out. Aunt Rose arranged for a distant cousin who was a United States citizen to fly to Hungary, marry my mother, and take her to the United States. There was just one catch. She couldn't leave with me. She would have to temporarily leave me with a couple that she had known for just a very short time. She finally made the agonizing decision and agreed to Aunt Rose's plan. I remember being carried in her arms to the train station and standing there as the train pulled away with my mother hanging out the window sobbing. But I was just 3.5 years old, and I was too busy picking pebbles up from the ground to even wave at her, and she never let me forget that. Fortunately, she had appointed an old family friend with good connections as my guardian, because immediately after she left Hungary, this trusted couple disappeared with me. They were unable to have children of their own, and they decided they would keep me. I have the telegram that my mother received from my guardian advising that the couple had disappeared. He urged her to stay put and promised that he would find me. 6 months later, she received another telegram. I had been found and was on my way to the United States. Here I am with my guardian shortly after he found me, and this slide also shows the actual flight manifest dated July 19th, 1948, with my name on the Pan Am flight from London to New York. I have no recollection how I found that. My mother's new marriage was only supposed to facilitate getting us out of Hungary, but somehow the distant cousin convinced her that they should stay married. She agreed, and that turned out to be a huge mistake. In less than 2 years, he became very violent. I remember coming home from kindergarten and finding my mother lying beaten on the living room floor. Shortly after that, we escaped, literally, in a desperate run one afternoon just before he came home from work. And that was the beginning of many frightening incidents that defined my life well into my 40s. Some of the chaos was due to the emotional damage that my mother suffered, and some of it was self-inflicted chaos due to the damage that I suffered. Our escape also marked the beginning of my journey through 9 different elementary schools, and that had a huge impact on my life. I was always the new kid on the block, and I had a very difficult time making friends. When I was 7, she married my stepfather. By the time I was 10, I had 2 new brothers. But my relationship with my stepfather was not good. He never treated me like a daughter, and I had a ton of emotional baggage. Now, not knowing how long I'd live in any one neighborhood, I wanted to make friends quickly, so I developed the habit of lying to make myself stand out. That backfired and only made things worse. Life at home was filled with hysteria and violence, and I hated being home. Bill and I started dating when I was 16 and he was 20. I had known him since I was 4. His family lived in the same Bronx apartment building that my mother and I lived in with her abusive husband. Bill's mom helped us escape, and our mothers had remained best friends for years. I was 19 when we married, and this year we celebrated our 61st wedding anniversary. Finally moving out on my own after my wedding, I thought that I was leaving all my troubles behind. What I didn't know back then is when you're part of the problem, you take your troubles with you wherever you go. Still trying to flee this suffocating relationship with my mother, we eventually moved from the New York area to Maryland, but having divorced my stepfather by then, my mother quickly followed. She needed me, and I did all that I could for her. Sadly, she was never able to give me what I needed from her. My life was a disaster for years, some of it of my own making, and some of it was just life in session. We were unable to have children of our own, so we adopted 2 baby boys. Our oldest son, David, was born to a mother who was on drugs and alcohol throughout her pregnancy. As a result, he suffered from severe ADHD. Within months after David was placed with us, Bill became critically ill. He was eventually diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, and he remained seriously ill for 10 years. Our second son, Jeremy, was born on the Navajo reservation. He was in a foster home for 3 months. During that entire time, he was never held or cuddled, and he suffered from failure to bond syndrome and became a lifelong alcoholic. Our life in Maryland was a roller coaster of ups and downs. Although my mother owned a house a short distance from ours, she spent much of her time in New Jersey. As a result, there were long periods of peace, and I have many wonderful memories of our early years as parents. Then in 1979, we moved again. My brothers had settled in California. We were very close. I had been many mom to them from the day they were born. It was easy to convince me that we couldn't spend the rest of our lives living a continent apart, so we moved to California. Trust me, there's a point to all of this. Everything fell apart rapidly. Bill, who had established a very successful business in Maryland, couldn't get a business going in California. He fell into a deep depression that lasted for years. There were constant battles between us, my mother, and my brothers. All of the relationships were in total chaos. And worst of all, my 2 young sons discovered drugs shortly after we moved to California. Life was one nightmare after another. I couldn't imagine anything worse. Then, in December of 1987, our 16-year-old drug-addicted son announced that his girlfriend was pregnant. Could my life get any worse? But Kim, the baby whose birth I feared, turned out to be a gift that I could never have imagined. Her mother could have easily kept us out of their lives, but she didn't. Kim's mom became like a daughter to us, and as a result, Kim became the center of our lives. But in spite of the joy that Kim brought, much of the rest of my life was still filled with rage and depression. The anger and resentment that I had developed for everyone around me was eating me alive. Then one fateful day, shortly after Kim was born, I heard someone say these words: "You may not have control over anything that's happening around you, but you have complete control over everything that happens between your 2 ears." Those were simple words, but something miraculous happened to me at that moment. For the first time in my life, I thought that perhaps my happiness or lack of happiness just might be a choice. Maybe I could find joy in my day, It was always very easy to see all the bad, but maybe I could seek what was good. Did I even have the capacity to be happy? I was drowning in depression, and I knew that my life depended on finding a different path. A friend convinced me to write a gratitude list every day. And of course, my gratitude list always started with the miracle of having Kim and her mom in our lives. I had begun to learn what really mattered. I took long walks and literally smelled the roses in just about every yard I passed. I probably looked pretty goofy to my neighbors. I was constantly reminding myself to listen to the sound of birds, notice beautiful clouds, appreciate everything of beauty that God had created. And all of that helped calm the rage in my head. I stopped myself from screaming every time something didn't meet my expectations. If necessary, I stopped my awful words in mid-sentence. I had hated everyone in my family and knew that I had to find a way to change that. There were people in my life that I wanted to love, so that became another daily list, reminding myself to seek out every good thing about my family every day. Hateful thoughts popped into my head on a regular basis. The worst times was when I was driving. So every time I got into the car, I turned on 50s music, my favorite, and sang along. You can't have random thoughts when you're singing. I had been programmed by nurture to see only what was bad in my life. But I was astonished to realize that I had the capacity to see what was good. I just had to learn how to tap into that. It took several years for me to overwrite the program in my head. I clearly remember the day that I realized I was no longer working it. What I desperately wanted was starting to come naturally. So much changed in my head that for a while I believed that nothing could ever bring me down again. However, two events challenged that belief in different but profound ways. Kim married a wonderful guy, had 3 boys, my amazing great-grandsons, and they eventually moved within walking distance of our California home. I was literally on cloud 9. But about 9 years ago, Kim's husband received a terrific career opportunity in Springfield, Missouri. They moved, and although I didn't admit it to them at the time, my world fell apart. Then, just 3 years later, they convinced Bill and me to move to Springfield, Missouri. They actually wanted us to live near them, and that was the beginning of the happiest chapter of my life. Yet, the blow we received in 2023 took me closer to the brink of despair than anything, since I had worked so hard to find happiness. Kim's father, our youngest son, passed away from liver failure at the age of 52. One more time, I had to return to daily gratitude lists, but now I was a different person, and it was easy to find all that was good in my life. I remind myself every day that my greatest joy comes from the gift that he left me. Kim and her family live just 5 minutes from us, and she drives me to speaking engagements that are more than an hour drive from my house. She couldn't come on this trip with me, so her husband is here with me. They're there when I need them. It's always tears of joy. I hope I'm not embarrassing you, Josh. Bill and I have rotating play dates every week with our great-grandsons. These wonderful twilight years of my life are happier than I can even describe. And I owe it all to those magic words that I heard so many years ago. Those words opened the door to a complete change in how I saw myself and the world around me. So just one last reminder. You may not have control over anything that's happening around you, but you have complete control over what happens between your 2 ears. Thank you, and I will answer any questions that you may have.
question, I'll bring the mic over.
Thank you so much. I'm curious if you still have, or if you have a relationship with Judaism at all.
Do I have a relationship with you? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm starting to get really tired. My relationship with Judaism, is that what the question was? Well, I never, ever stopped being Jewish. I speak at a lot of schools, and I've had kids ask me, are you still Jewish? Yeah. However, my relationship with Judaism and with God has been a roller coaster. I've been through probably every possible aspect of it, from, there is no God, God's terrible for allowing this to happen. I've been all over the place with it. But today, I'm grateful. I have a very close relationship with God. As a matter of fact, we have Springfield as a very tiny Jewish community. There is a Reformed temple that was there when we first moved there, and it was the only game in town. We joined and got very involved. In fact, I'm the treasurer now this year. And then exactly a year ago, Chabad came to Springfield. And we've gotten very involved with that. So between Temple Israel and Chabad, my husband and I are just doing Jewish things all week long. We love it.
Other questions?
I don't need to know. Can you tell me how you did all that research, how you found all the documents and the information about your family?
Well, it started with the pictures that you saw in the slides. When my parents got married, one of the wedding gifts that my father gave to my mother was a photo album. And thank God, the first thing she did was put pictures of her family in it. When the Nazis came to Hungary and things got bad and she had to be on the move, the only thing she had was me in a pram with that photo album under my mattress. And that was a family treasure for a very, very long time, until scanners were invented. The rest of it, my mother always was willing to answer any question that I asked. Since I started speaking, which has been over 10 years now, and I listened to some of the questions that the kids asked me, I realized that I wish I had asked her hundreds more, because there's so much that I don't know. But she always answered my questions. I was able to interview her sister-in-law, the one who was with my Aunt Margie when she died. She gave me a lot of information, and she was also the one who told me how my Aunt Olga died, because my mother would never talk about her. And then I eventually got on the internet, started doing a lot of research, hired someone in Hungary to do research. So it's been many, many years of lots of research.
Yeah.
When you go to like schools and stuff, how do you have the kids how do you say it in a more easier way for kids?
I don't, because I usually talk to kids that are older than you. The youngest class I ever spoke to, and I was really kind of on the fence about it, were 10-year-olds. But usually it's high school. I'd say probably 80% of the schools that I speak at are high schools, and occasionally middle schools, but the higher grades in the middle schools. A few years ago, there was an exhibit that came to Kansas City, which is just a couple hours drive from where we live, and it was an exhibit about Auschwitz. And my oldest great-grandson at that time, I think he was maybe 11 or 12 years old. And I asked my granddaughter and her husband if they thought he was old enough to go, and they said, absolutely, take him. So we took James with us, but usually I talk to older kids.
Other questions?
There is no question that I won't answer, so just do it.
Have you ever returned to Hungary just to see your childhood home?
Yes. I've been back to Hungary a few times. Okay. I've been to Hungary a few times. First time it was with our rabbi in California who took a lot of congregants through an Eastern European heritage tour. But the trip that meant the most to me was, we just did it, I think it was maybe 7 years ago, my husband and I, and the older of my two brothers and his wife, we went to Hungary for 10 days, and by that time, I had a ton of information. I had learned the address of the house that my mother was born in. I had the address of the house where I was born. I even had the address of the apartment building that my mother and Olga lived in when Olga died. And it also learned the cemetery where my father is buried in a mass grave, and I had learned what cemetery that mass grave was in. So we went for 10 days, hired a guide, gave him all that information, and literally I traced my family's life and my early life on that trip.
Do you feel like your mother was ever able to find peace?
My mother never found peace. And that's sad. She was never able to say the words that I needed to hear. Surprisingly, after she passed away, I was going through her papers, I found an envelope, and this is, I don't know if it was the best or the cruelest thing that ever happened in my life, but I found an envelope. And it had my name on it, and I opened it, and it was just a piece of paper, and all she had written was, Erika, you were a good daughter. She never said that to me when she was alive. I was always the worst thing. So I tried to get her to go to therapy because I went to therapy a lot, and she just wouldn't do it. She just couldn't get past her pain. Yes.
I have a couple questions. Your brothers, how were they affected by your mother's PTSD, basically? And then also, where's your oldest son?
Well, I'll answer that second question first. My oldest son still lives in California, and we are trying constantly to get him to move to Springfield, Missouri. He's single. He doesn't have any reason to have to stay there. And I think we're getting closer to the possibility. My brothers were very, very profoundly affected because my mother wasn't able to be a good mother to any of her 3 children. So they were affected in different ways. And one of my greatest frustrations is that, I speak at schools. You've heard my story, and I get feedback from people that get the point of the second part of my story, and that we can change. It doesn't matter what happened earlier. We can change how we see things. I have not been able to get either of my brothers to do that, and I find that very ironic. But I'm very close to them, amazingly close. They live in California. We text each other good morning with hearts every morning. In fact, now I'm going to make myself cry. when we were on the shuttle bus this afternoon going to get our rental car, the older of my two brothers texted me and he said, "Can I call you?" So I texted him back. I said, "No, can we talk tomorrow? I'm late, I'm running late, blah, blah, blah." And my phone rang after I said don't. So he calls me anyway, and he's telling me about a friend of his that he recently lost, and the guy was fine, he was healthy, and he just dropped dead in the parking lot of a restaurant. And I'm thinking, what's so important about this that he had to call me while I was, going nuts. And he said, I just want you to know, I want you to take care of yourself. I want you to know how much I love you. I'm so blessed. Yes.
When did you have to teach your children about all this stuff?
My children, my sons, have experienced this knowledge, I think, the same way I did, because I've had students ask me, when did my mother first start telling me? And my answer is, I have no recollection of ever being told. I just always knew. So it must have been something that she talked about openly in front of me. And I did ask my sons after they were grown, do they remember me telling them? And they both had said no. We just always knew.
Yeah, I guess as a follow-up to your mother and your brothers, you were saying kind of this lack of peace, and you were able to find peace, and that phrase affected you really profoundly. I was wondering if you could just speak more to that process. I know there was something with the music, and there were techniques, but it just seems amazing, so I'm curious.
It was, I'm asked that a lot because the people, one of the most fulfilling things that I get out of doing this is the feedback I get from that part of my story. People that tell me that, wow, they needed to hear that, and wow, how can they do it? It was, I think what happened to me was, it was like lightning. Just suddenly my brain realized that I did not have to continue. I mean, I had no capacity to be happy. I can't even describe. I mean, when I try to tell people, I did a complete 180, it feels like an understatement. I had no capacity to be happy. I had no capacity, no matter what was going on around me. I always saw the bad in everything, and I always saw the bad in the people around me. So when I had that bolt of lightning moment, when I heard those words, something just happened that made me totally commit to the process of changing how my brain was programmed. So it really was, I had to forgive myself a lot, because you don't change overnight, and when you're trying to change, there are, two steps forward, 3 steps back sometimes. And that's why, one of the things I said was there were times when I was screaming at, and it was usually my husband, because nothing that he could do was good enough. I was really mean to him. I was constantly yelling at him. And when I realized I wanted to change that, as soon as I started yelling at him and realizing how toxic that felt, I would just stop mid-sentence. Sometimes I was able to say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. Sometimes I had to just walk out of the room and take a time out. So it was a long, it took a lot of years, because I was in my 40s when I started the process. And I made lists of things I had to do, like, go out, take a walk, look at the clouds, smell the roses, listen to the birds. I mean, to this day, I'll be sitting in my kitchen and looking out in the back, and I'll see, birds flying or, stopping on one of the chairs in the back and I go, wow, look at that bird. It's just become natural now. And, when you can teach yourself to see things that way, it just changes everything in your head. But it was a commitment to see the positive in people. If I started thinking bad thoughts about somebody, and not everybody has positive. I'm not telling you I love everyone, but I'm talking about my family. I wanted to love my family, and I knew they were good people. So I just started noticing the good things they did, and if bad thoughts came into my head, if I wasn't in the car, I would sometimes go in and turn. I still have a record player and all my vinyl, and I would put music on, and I'd start singing, and that really helped, because it just brought that anger level down. So it was a constant commitment, and it worked. Yes.
What got you to, you said that you went to therapy at some point. What was it that got you to consider going for the first time? Or
Well, I knew I was miserable. And
did somebody?
No, I had always known that there was something profoundly wrong with my life. I don't think that I knew until I became an adult, kind of well into my adult years, that there was something wrong in my relationship with my mother, because having experienced her from the time I was a little kid, I didn't know that there was anything different. This is the way she is. She tells me I'm a piece of whatever. The worst thing she ever said to me was if I didn't do something the way she wanted me to do it, she would say, Hitler didn't hurt me the way you do. So it was, and I'm not judging her. I want you to know I don't blame her. She was destroyed. She was totally destroyed by it. I can't imagine what it's like to be in your 20s, lose your husband, lose everyone in your family. I think I probably want to put a bullet through my brain, honestly, if I went through that. So I thank her for living and keeping me alive. But so I knew that I was miserable, and I kept trying different ways to get through it. I joined there was a group that was started in California of child survivors. I joined that. It was a therapy group. Joined that. That didn't work. I tried different therapists. Nothing worked until I heard those words, and something just clicked.
Can you remind us what the words were that you heard?
You may not have control over anything that's happening around you, but you have complete control over everything that happens between your two ears. Truer words were never spoken. Yes. Yeah. Real loud.
When you were first doing your first story time, how did you feel?
Oh, when I was first telling my story, how did I feel? I cried through the whole thing. The first time I told it was at the Los Angeles Holocaust Museum. And I have to back up a couple of days at how that even came about. I had already spent 20 years, because I was in my mid-60s by then. I'm 81 now. So I had spent 20 years working on this new me. And part of what I had to do during those 20 years was literally put all thoughts of the Holocaust out of my head, out of my life. I couldn't talk about it, didn't want to talk about it. I wanted to just be a whole different person. It had nothing to do with that. And I had done that for about 20 years. And my husband and I were at it was a program, it was a Jewish program for some Jewish holiday, and I can't remember which one it was. But we were in a room with about 300 people sitting in the audience, and the person who was conducting the program said, if there are any Holocaust survivors in the room, would you please stand? We'd like to honor you. So I was sitting there, and my husband gave me a sharp poke, and he just looked at me and he said, enough, stand up. So I did. And I looked around, and to my amazement, I was the only one standing. And that was when it hit me that as one of the youngest Holocaust survivors, I had a job to do. I needed to start telling the story. And that was on a Sunday. The next day I called the Los Angeles Holocaust Museum and asked to be on their speaker program. So that was where I started, and for a very long time, I cried through the whole thing. I could barely get through it. Now I just cry the happy tears at the end. But it was very, very hard. Very, very hard.
I'm curious if since October 7th, if the work that you're doing has changed or been affected in any way, or just anything that may have surrounded those events that has affected your world.
Well, the first thing about October 7th is it made me more frightened than I had ever been as a Jew. I mean, I was 4 years old when I came to the United States. I think like all of us, felt very safe here. I don't anymore. And it's mostly because of the things that happen in the universities. I find that absolutely horrifying. I also get a lot more requests to speak. And for some reason, the spring is always where I get most of the requests. So the effect that has on me, that I noticed for the first time last year, was if I don't pace myself, I start to get into a depression. So I am learning to pace myself and to say no when I have to say no. Yes.
Have you been to Israel? Can you tell us about it?
I've been to Israel many, many, many times. My mother's, my grandfather on my mother's side, most of his siblings survived the war. So I have second cousins from my grandfathers. Their grandparents were my grandfather's siblings. So I have many second cousins that all live in Israel. So I have been there many, many times, and I love it, and I wish I could go back, but I think we're getting a little too old for a trip like that, but I feel so at home there. Yes?
Get through your emotions.
How did my husband get through? I think I gave him the autoimmune disease that he got. Well, he had Crohn's disease. And what we've learned about Crohn's is that it lies dormant until some very stressful things can bring it out. So that's why I say maybe I did it. Because I was awful to him. I really was. I'm not anymore, but I was. But he stuck with it. He stuck with me. And like I said, 61 years now. And he's at home being very, very depressed that he's not here with me, but we just can't travel together anymore. Because we can't take care of each other the way we need to when we're traveling. He's very frail.
With what we see, you mentioned at the universities, I'm wondering how your story is received with the high school kids. You speak a lot there, and is there a big difference, and is it accepted And how do you feel about that?
I have never had a disrespectful experience at any of my talks. I have spoken, the only universities that I've spoken at have been in Missouri. I've never spoken at a California university or New York or anywhere else. Just, I live in Springfield. There's a Missouri State University, very large campus there. I've spoken there. And then there's also one in Rolla, Missouri, and I've been asked to speak there. The high school kids, I mean, everywhere. I've spoken at churches, civic organizations, museums, and I have never, ever had a disrespectful thing said to me or a disrespectful question asked.
Good.
Yeah, thank God for that. Yes?
I had a sister who lived, well, I have a sister. And she lived in Budapest for over 10 years, I believe. She worked with a lot of human rights groups there. And I went to I visited her a few times, and once we took a tour, and we went around with a guide who was a friend of hers, and we happened to go into, and we got permission, I think, somehow we got in there because it was all chained up, and I think maybe the guard let us in, the synagogue in Budapest, and we got in there, and it was just a shell of itself, and I don't think anything's ever done with it, but she told us that it was the second largest synagogue in the world.
Well, the synagogue in Budapest has been restored.
Oh.
Yeah, because when we were there, the last time that I was there, the first few times I went to Hungary, yeah, it hadn't been, but it's been restored.
Yeah, well, she's back in the States now, but I would love to see it. But the reason why, one of the questions it's a roundabout question, is that since it was the second largest, the guide told us in the world, and the largest was in New York City, it gives me the impression that Hungary had a very large Jewish population, and was it just decimated?
Well, before the war, there were almost 1 million Hungarian Jews. After the war, there were a little over 300,000. And that was all done in a matter of months, because Hungary was the last country that the Nazis took over. And by that time, in all the years that they'd been doing it, they perfected their killing machine, and they murdered, I think it was over 500,000, over 600,000 Jews, literally in a matter of a couple of months.
Any last questions that haven't had a chance to ask?
First, just want to say I appreciate this perspective that you shared with us, because it's different than other presentations that I've heard. You talked a little bit about, doing several of these in the spring and kind of breaking down. What's a technique that you use when you feel like the rumination or the re-traumatizing is, offsetting your ability to, see positive, to grasp and gratitude? It's like reading it, maybe one of the techniques you found more effective for kind of getting through.
So what technique do I use when I feel myself getting down as a result of telling the story? I am very, very blessed that I don't have to have a technique. Last year, I definitely overdid it. Last spring, it was horrendous. By the time I was done, I literally for 3 months from, I think it was March, April, May last year, that it was just nonstop. It was every week, sometimes multiple talks, not only in a week, sometimes multiple talks in a day. And I was a wreck. Several months ago, and I don't know if, where are you, Josh? When did we start the, weekly play dates with the kids?
It was a couple months ago.
Okay, so, and it was before the spring started. And as I said, we have rotating play dates with the 3 boys. They're 8, 11, and 14, and even the 14-year-old wants to do it. And each week, we have one of them, my husband and I just do whatever they want to do. And that has totally kept going down any rabbit holes. Because we just have so much fun. And I'm just really how blessed I am to be where I am and to have what I have. So it's been a lot easier this year. That's my technique. I don't need a technique. My technique lives 5 minutes away from me.
So, I think of Holocaust speakers as limiting point to get the story out. People have to know the history. But you're like a metaphor for history. You're a survivor. And your story is a story of personal survival. So, just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been told my story is very different. And I love telling it because I love, especially when I'm in schools and when I'm speaking to a group of kids, almost every time I see a light go on in at least one kid's eyes. There's always at least one kid who gets it. And that is everything to me.
I just want to say thank you because I have 2 young kids younger than 10, and it was really important for me to have them hear from a survivor, and knowing that there are so few opportunities for that. I just really appreciate you doing this and tolerating maybe the younger kids in here and sharing your stories. So thank you very much.
Yes.
I also want to say thank you. I cried through the whole thing for you. So, we're here, some of the story, I don't really, it's not a story that we hear because we hear about the whole process and not about the whole generational trauma always. Often not, really. And thank you for that. And also, I think your mother just was so afraid to love you so much.
I agree.
It wasn't you, it was her.
I know she.
To love you so much. I mean, I know she did, but
She did.
she was afraid to, she felt like she could lose you. It was such a
I know that was a big part of it. I remember one time going out with a guy and we were at his parents' house and his parents were there, so there was nothing going on, but I fell asleep on the couch and those idiots didn't wake me up. They just all went to bed. And I woke up, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. And I remember he drove me home, and Mother was standing in the middle of the street, unfortunately with a wooden spoon in her hand. And I was black and blue by the time we even got to the door. But yeah, that's how she showed me she loved me. But I could, looking back at it now, I think you're right. That she was so terrified of losing me that she just didn't know how to handle it.
We have 2 more questions, one here and another here.
Have you recorded your talk and put it on YouTube?
My talk is all over the internet. I mean, if you Google Erika Schwartz, Hungary, Holocaust, it's all over. There's articles, there's newspaper articles, magazine articles, recordings, yeah.
Sure.
I'm so grateful for every single person in this room, but I do have a question, which is, I recognize so many of you because we are part of our small Jewish community, and how can our communities bring more non-Jewish people to hear what you are saying, especially at times like these?
I can't answer that because I get invited to speak at churches all the time. I mean, it just happens. I've been invited, not only at churches, but Christian schools. There, in the Springfield area, there are a couple Christian schools, and they've had me, there's one school that has me every year, so that the different students can hear. So I think maybe just letting them know. And I'm gonna have a lot of downtime these next couple of days. You guys did not. So, we could probably put something else in, like maybe tomorrow afternoon. If you got somebody, let me know.
If I may, Sherry, I think your comment is perhaps a good comment for us to close on, if that's okay, Erika. And I think I'd like to propose three things. One, I'd like us to look around for a moment and start, end where we started, to recognize that there are a lot of people who are not here. And I think my hope would be that each one of us takes this story and we find a friend who might need to hear this story, and we share that with them. Whether it's a Jewish friend or a Christian friend or a Muslim friend or a Buddhist friend, whoever it is, that we take Erika's story and we share it, because I think it needs to be heard. Number two, I'd like us to sing a song and wrap up with prayer, and then we'll end up together singing a song and a prayer for peace. But first, before we do that, if we can stand and give Erika a big round of If you're willing to stay standing, this is a prayer that we say at the end of most of our services. It's a prayer that's an expression of yearning for peace, and Erika, you frame this in such a beautiful way of what it would mean for us to find peace between our ears, no matter the circumstances that we face. I think that's a frame for us to think about as we say these words. If you know them, please sing along. If you don't, then I encourage you to just settle into them. And if you want to meet someone next to you and put an arm around them, just ask first. But if you want to put an arm around someone next to you, please do. This is one of the songs we sing at almost all of our prayer services. I'm not a chazan. I'm not our singing leader. I'm our speaking leader. So bear with me. Okay. Josh, you're desired.
There's Josh right there.
We'll flank her with Josh. Shalom Aleinu, Ve'achol Yisrael, Ve'eru Amen. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, Ve'achol Yisrael, Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, Ve'achol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, Ve'achol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, Ve'achol
Now I missed a photo.
Oh, you didn't get
Of
one?
that. No, I was just sharing Samuel.
Oh, I will. It will be on the video.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Yeah. Are we wanting to end?